She was 8 months pregnant when they strapped her to the operating table. No anesthesia. No mercy. The doctors wanted to observe how disease spread from mother to unborn child. So they cut her open while she was still conscious and removed the fetus to study it. She died screaming. The baby died in a petri dish, and the man who ordered this experiment went on to become one of Japan's most respected medical professors. His name was Masaji Kitano, and what he did to pregnant women at Unit 731 was worse than anything you can imagine. This is his story. August 1945. Unit 731 was being destroyed. Shiro Ishii, the facility's commander, had fled. Buildings were burning. Prisoners were being executed. Evidence was disappearing, but one man stayed behind to coordinate the final destruction. His name was Major General Masaji Kitano. Kitano had been Ishii's right-hand man for nearly a decade. When Ishii had traveled to Tokyo for meetings, Kitano ran the facility. When Ishii designed experiments, Kitano perfected them. And when Ishii wanted results, Kitano delivered no matter the cost. While Ishii became infamous after the war, Kitano remained in the shadows. He gave fewer interviews. He left behind fewer documents, but those who survived Unit 731 remembered him differently than they remembered Ishii. Ishii was the visionary, the ambitious scientist, obsessed with biological warfare. Kitano was something else. He was methodical, precise, and some say, even more cruel. Because while Ishii experimented on all prisoners equally, Kitano had a specific interest. He was obsessed with reproduction, with maternal health, with the vulnerabilities of pregnancy. And he used the captive women at Unit 731 as his laboratory. Masaji Kitano was born in 1897 in Japan, 5 years after Shiro Ishii. Like Ishii, he came from a privileged background and showed exceptional academic promise. He attended the Tokyo Imperial University School of Medicine, graduating in 1922 with honors in pathology, the study of disease. But while Ishii was outgoing and charismatic, Kitano was reserved and calculating. Where Ishii inspired loyalty through force of personality, Kitano earned respect through competence. He was the type of man who never raised his voice, who maintained perfect composure, who saw human beings as biological systems to be analyzed. After graduation, Kitano joined the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. He specialized in infectious diseases and epidemic prevention, the perfect background for what was to come. In the late 1920s, as Ishii began advocating for biological warfare research, Kitano was one of his earliest supporters. The two men shared a belief that biological weapons represented the future of warfare, but they approached the subject differently. Ishii was interested in mass casualties, how to kill thousands of enemy soldiers efficiently. Kitano was interested in something more specific, how disease affected different populations, particularly women and children. In 1936, when Unit 731 was established in Pingfang, Kitano was appointed as Ishii's deputy commander. He was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the research divisions. While Ishii handled politics and funding, Kitano managed the experiments. Unit 731 was divided into several divisions. Division 1 focused on bacteria research, plague, cholera, anthrax. Division 2 studied weapons development, how to deliver these pathogens effectively. Division 3 handled production, breeding massive quantities of disease-carrying fleas and rats. Division 4 was in charge of the prisoners. Kitano oversaw all of them, but he took a particular interest in a smaller, more secretive program: the study of maternal and fetal health under extreme conditions. To the outside world, this might have seemed like legitimate medical research. In reality, it was a systematic torture of pregnant women. Why was Kitano obsessed with this? Some historians believe it was purely scientific curiosity. Others suggest it was related to Japan's militaristic goals understanding. Reproduction could help maximize the birth rate of Japanese soldiers while devastating enemy populations through targeted biological attacks. But testimonies from survivors suggest something darker. They described Kitano as a man who showed no emotion during the most horrific procedures, who took detailed notes while women screamed, who viewed pregnancy not as the miracle of life, but as a biological process to be dissected, studied, and weaponized. One nurse who worked at Unit 731 later testified that Kitano once said, "A pregnant woman is the perfect test subject. You can study two organisms at once, the host and the parasite." He called unborn children parasites. Women made up approximately 20 to 30% of Unit 731's prisoners. They came from the same places as the male prisoners arrested as suspected spies, resistance fighters, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Chinese, Korean, Russian, Mongolian, young and old. Some were prostitutes arrested during military raids. Others were farmers captured during village sweeps. Many were simply civilians who happened to cross paths with the Japanese military. But pregnant women were treated differently from the moment they arrived. While other prisoners were immediately assigned to various experiment groups, pregnant women were separated. They were given slightly better food, slightly cleaner cells, medical examinations to determine the health of the fetus. This wasn't mercy. It was quality control. Kitano wanted healthy pregnancies. He wanted healthy fetuses. Because sick or malnourished subjects would skew his data. Women who arrived at Unit 731 already pregnant were considered valuable. But Kitano didn't want to rely on random arrivals. He wanted a steady supply of test subjects. So he created one. Female prisoners who were not pregnant were sometimes forcibly impregnated. Male prisoners were selected and ordered to rape female prisoners under threat of death. Guards participated. Even some of the lower-ranking medical staff were ordered to impregnate prisoners as part of their duties. The women had no choice. The men often had no choice. It was systematic rape as part of an experiment. The sole purpose was to create pregnant test subjects for Kitano's research. Once a woman became pregnant, she was moved to a special section of the prison what staff cynically called the maternity ward. There were approximately 30 cells reserved for pregnant women at any given time. The conditions were marginally better than the general prison population, but only because Kitano needed the pregnancies to develop normally until he was ready to experiment. The women in these cells knew what was coming. Survivors who were held in adjacent cells later testified that they could hear the pregnant women crying at night, praying in their native languages, begging to be killed before their time came. But Kitano was meticulous. He waited until pregnancies reached specific stages: first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. Each stage offered different research opportunities, and he documented everything with clinical precision. One of the most chilling aspects of Kitano's program was the complete In his notes, pregnant women weren't referred to by name or even by number. They were logged as specimen, a maternal, or subject B. The word gravid means pregniatis, typically used for animals. These weren't women to Kitano. They were biological containers, incubators, for his research subjects. What Kitano did to these women cannot be fully described without causing distress. But to understand the depth of his crimes, you need to know what happened. I will describe this as factually and respectfully as possible, but please be aware that what follows is deeply disturbing. Kitano's primary research interest was understanding how diseases transferred from mother to fetus. He infected pregnant women with various pathogens: syphilis, gonorrhea, plague, typhoid, monitored the progression. Some infections were delivered through injection, others through contaminated food or water. Some women were exposed to disease-carrying fleas. The purpose was to determine at what stage of pregnancy a fetus becomes infected, how quickly the infection spreads, and whether the fetus develops any immunity. To answer these questions, Kitano needed to observe the disease progression in living tissue. This meant vivisection, surgical dissection of a living organism. Pregnant women were taken to the operating theater at various stages of infection. They were strapped to tables, and without anesthesia, they were cut open. The doctors removed the fetus while the mother was still alive and conscious, so they could observe the real-time effects of the pathogen on both organisms. Why no anesthesia? Kitano claimed that anesthesia could affect the spread of disease and contaminate the data, but survivors testified that he was simply indifferent to suffering. One nurse recalled Kitano saying, "Pain is a variable we can control. Screaming is just noise." The procedures could take hours. Medical staff would systematically remove organs, take samples, make observations, all while the woman remained conscious. When they were done, neither mother nor child survived. The bodies were cremated. The data was filed, but disease transmission wasn't Kitano's only focus. He also studied the effects of malnutrition during pregnancy. Women would be given minimal calories, sometimes as little as 300 to 400 calories per day while their pregnancies progressed. The goal was to determine the minimum nutrition needed to sustain a pregnancy and to Observe the effects of starvation on fetal development. These women slowly withered away while their fetuses consumed what little resources their bodies had left. When they reached late-term pregnancy, they were dissected. Kitano wanted to see how the body prioritized resources. Whether the fetus or the mother's vital organs received nutrients first, he conducted pressure experiments on pregnant women, placing them in chambers where air pressure was rapidly increased or decreased. He wanted to know if pregnancy made women more or less susceptible to pressure-related injuries, and how the fetus responded to the stress. He performed amputations on pregnant women, removing limbs without anesthesia to study body's stress response during pregnancy. Would the trauma trigger premature labor? Would the fetus absorb stress hormones? How much blood could a pregnant woman lose before both organisms died? And he conducted cold exposure experiments, specifically on pregnant women. They were taken outside in sub-zero temperatures and left until parts of their body froze. Then they were brought inside, and the thawing process was observed. The research notes described fetal movement slowing as the mother's body temperature dropped, eventually stopping entirely. Perhaps the most disturbing experiments involved forced labor. Women in their third trimester were given drugs to induce labor, but were prevented from delivering. The purpose was to study prolonged labor stress, to see how long a woman could survive the continuous contractions without medical intervention. These experiments sometimes lasted days, before both mother and child died from exhaustion and complications. Throughout all of this, Kitano remained emotionally detached. He observed. "E documenti?" He refined his techniques. To him, these weren't atrocities, they were experiments. These weren't women, they were subjects. These weren't babies, they were specimens. Kitano didn't conduct these experiments alone. He had a team of doctors, nurses, and technicians. These were educated professionals, many with families of their own. Some of them had children. Some of their wives were pregnant during the years they worked at Unit 731. Yet they participated in experiments on pregnant women without hesitation. How do ordinary people become capable of such atrocities? The answer is both complex and terrifyingly simple. Dehumanization, authority, and moral disengagement. The staff at Unit 731 were taught that the prisoners weren't fully human. They were told these were criminals, spies, enemies of the state. The propaganda was relentless. Chinese, Koreans, Russians, they were portrayed as subhuman, undeserving of compassion. This psychological conditioning allowed doctors to see suffering without feeling empathy. The prisoners were never called by name. They were Maruta logs. The pregnant women were gravid specimens. This linguistic dehumanization created psychological distance. It's easier to cut open a specimen than a person. It's easier to ignore screams when they come from a log instead of a woman. Authority played a crucial role. Kitano was a respected superior officer. His orders were absolute. In the rigidly hierarchical structure of the Japanese military, questioning a superior was unthinkable. Refusing an order could result in court-martial or execution. Many staff members later claimed they were just following orders, the same defense used by Nazi war criminals. But testimonies from survivors revealed that some staff members went beyond their orders. Some showed enthusiasm. Some volunteered for the most brutal procedures. One nurse later testified that a particular doctor would hum while conducting. Another would joke with colleagues while prisoners screamed in the background. This wasn't reluctant compliance. For some, it became normalized, even routine. One doctor who worked under Kitano later said in an interview, decades after the war, that, after the first few experiments, he stopped thinking about the prisoners as people. They became like the rats we used in earlier research, he said. You don't feel guilty about dissecting a rat. But not everyone was comfortable. There are documented cases of staff members who requested transfers, who developed psychological problems, who turned to alcohol to cope with what they were witnessing. Some suffered nightmares. Some broke down. Kitano dealt with these cases efficiently. Those who couldn't handle the work were transferred to other units or sent back to Japan. But they were also sworn to secrecy. If they spoke about what they had seen, they would be court-martialed for treason. The silence was enforced through fear. And Kitano led by example. He never showed emotion. Never hesitated. Never acknowledged that what he was doing might be wrong. His cold rationality set the tone for the entire program. If the commander sees these experiments as legitimate science, then they must be legitimate. If he shows no remorse, Why should anyone else? One survivor who worked as a forced laborer at Unit 731, cleaning the facilities, described Kitano this way. Isia was a devil who shouted and commanded. Kitano was worse. He was a devil who smiled and whispered. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger. He was always polite, always professional. That's what made him terrifying. He treated horror as if it were normal. Very few people survived Kitano's experiments. By design, almost all subjects died during or shortly after the procedures. But a handful of women survived their time at Unit 731, either because they were held in adjacent cells and witnessed what happened, or because they were liberated by Soviet forces before they could be experimented upon. Their testimonies are heartbreaking. One Chinese woman, held at Unit 731 in 1944, described hearing the screams of pregnant women being taken to the operating theater. She was in a cell, 3 doors down from the maternity ward. She could hear everything. The cries for mercy, the sounds of the procedures, the silence that followed. She testified that she once saw a pregnant woman being dragged down the corridor. The woman was screaming in Chinese, begging them to kill her quickly, to not let them cut her open alive. The guards said nothing. They just pulled her along and disappeared through the double doors at the end of the hall. The screaming continued for hours. Then it stopped. Another survivor, a Korean woman, described being placed in the maternity ward after discovering she was pregnant. She was in her 2nd month. She knew what awaited her. For 3 months, she lived in that cell, watching her pregnancy develop, knowing that once she reached a certain point, they would come for her. She tried to induce a miscarriage by throwing herself against the cell wall. It didn't work. She tried starvation, refusing food for days. The guards force-fed her. She couldn't escape her fate. But then, in August 1945, something changed. The guards became agitated. There was commotion. The facility was being evacuated. Most prisoners were executed to eliminate witnesses, but in the chaos, some were overlooked. She was one of them. Soviet troops arrived days later and found her still alive, 5 months pregnant, weighing less than 90 pounds. She survived. Her baby did not. She miscarried a week after liberation, likely due to the stress and malnutrition. She never learned why she had been spared when so many others died. A Russian woman, captured in 1943, testified about what she witnessed in the adjacent cell block. She described hearing a woman in labor screaming for help, begging for someone to help her deliver. But no help came. The labor was being deliberately prolonged as part of an experiment. The screaming went on for 3 days. By the 3rd day, the screams had become weak, barely audible. Then they stopped. The woman giving testimony broke down crying during her interview in 1949. She said the worst part was on what she heard. It was knowing that she could do nothing, that the gods ignored the screaming as if it were background noise, that the doctors walked past that cell on their way to lunch, discussing baseball scores and weekend plans, while a woman died in agony just meters away. These testimonies didn't come easily. Many survivors were too traumatized to speak about what they had witnessed. Some developed psychological disorders. Some took decades before they could bring themselves to testify. And when they did speak, they were often dismissed or ignored. The Japanese government didn't acknowledge Unit 731 for decades. Chinese and Korean testimonies were treated with skepticism. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that historians began seriously documenting survivor accounts. By then, most of the women who had been held at Unit 731 had died, their stories lost forever. But those few testimonies that do exist paint a clear picture. Kitano's experiments on pregnant women were systematic, brutal, and conducted with complete disregard for human life. These women were seen as disposable. Their suffering was data. Their deaths were routine. August 9, 1945. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Unit 731 had days, maybe hours, before Soviet troops arrived. Kitano, following Ishii's orders, began the systematic destruction of the facility. All prisoners who had survived the experiments were executed. The maternity ward was emptied. Pregnant women, women in labor, women recovering from procedures, all were killed. Some were given lethal injections. Some were burned alive when the buildings were set on fire. The medical equipment was destroyed. The laboratories were blown up, Documents were burned by the thousands. Kitano personally oversaw the destruction of his research on pregnant women, making sure every file, every photograph, every detailed observation was reduced to ash. But like Ishii, Kitano made sure to preserve copies of the most important data. He knew the war was ending. He knew the Americans would want information, and he knew that information was his insurance policy. Kitano fled Unit 731 on August 11th, 2 days before Soviet forces reached the facility. He made his way back to Japan, traveling under an assumed name. For months, he remained in hiding, waiting to see what would happen. The Americans, through their intelligence networks, discovered that Unit 731 had conducted biological warfare research. They began searching for the scientists involved. When they found Ishii, they found Kitano. In 1946, American investigators interviewed Kitano. He was cooperative, professional, and unemotional. He explained the structure of Unit 731. He described the research programs. He provided detailed information about biological weapons development. But he was careful about what he revealed. He emphasized the scientific value of the research. He downplayed the human experimentation. He never mentioned the pregnant women. He never described the vivisections. He presented Unit 731 as a legitimate medical research facility that sometimes used prisoners for experiments, much like the Allies did. The Americans, eager for biological warfare intelligence, didn't push too hard. They wanted data, not war crimes, confessions, and Kitano gave them enough to satisfy their curiosity while protecting himself from prosecution. In exchange for his cooperation, Kitano received immunity from war crimes trials. His name was kept out of the Tokyo war crimes trials. The experiments on pregnant women were never mentioned. The testimonies of survivors were never heard in court. The deal was done. Kitano was free. After the war, Masaji Kitano returned to civilian life in Japan. He never faced trial. He was never imprisoned. He never publicly acknowledged what he had done at Unit 731. In one after the war, Masaji Kitano returned to civilian life in Japan. He never faced trial. He was never imprisoned. He never publicly acknowledged what he had done at Unit 7. In 1947, he joined the faculty of Osaka University School of Medicine as a professor of pathology of the same field he had studied before joining Unit 17. He supervised research. He published papers in respected medical journals. None of his publications mentioned Unit 731. None of his colleagues asked questions they didn't want answered. Kitano became a respected member of Japan's medical establishment. He gave lectures at conferences. He served on medical boards. He consulted for pharmaceutical companies. His expertise in infectious diseases was valued. His past was ignored. Unlike Ishii, who occasionally gave interviews and became somewhat known to the public, Kitano remained in the shadows. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He lived quietly, respectably, as if the years at Unit 731 had never happened. He married. He had children. He had grandchildren. He lived in a comfortable house in a nice neighborhood. He attended university functions. He went to dinner parties with colleagues. He lived a completely normal life. The women he experimented on had no such peace. Those who survived carried trauma that never healed. Those who died were never properly mourned. Their babies were never named. Their suffering was erased from official history. Kitano died in 1986, at the age of 89. Natural causes, surrounded by family. His obituary in medical journals praised his contributions to pathology. There was no mention of Unit 731. No mention of pregnant women. No mention of the hundreds he had tortured and killed. He was buried with honors. Medical students who had studied under him attended the funeral. Colleagues gave speeches praising his dedication to science. He died with his reputation intact. To this day, there is no memorial for his victims, no acknowledgement from the Japanese government, no apology to the families. The women he killed remain nameless, their stories untold, their suffering unrecognized. The story of Masaji Kitano is almost unknown outside of academic circles. While everyone knows about the Holocaust, few have heard about Unit 731. While Nazi doctors were tried and executed at Nuremberg, Japanese doctors lived free lives and died peacefully. Why? Because the United States decided that the scientific data from Unit 731 was more valuable than justice for the victims. Because the Cold War made allies out of former enemies. Because politics trumped morality. But this isn't just a story about one man or one facility. It's a story about what happens when we dehumanize others. When we see people as objects, when we prioritize national interests over human rights, when we allow atrocities to be forgotten because they're inconvenient. The pregnant women who suffered at Unit 731 were someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's wife. The babies who died in those experiments would have had names, would have had lives, would have had futures. All of that was stolen from them. And the men who stole it lived a long, comfortable, respected life. We must remember these stories, not to create hatred, but to ensure that this level of dehumanization never happens again. Because it can happen. It has happened. And without memory, without accountability, it will happen again. This was the story of Masaji, the man who experimented on pregnant women and was never punished. But there were other doctors at Unit 731. Other experiments. Other victims whose stories need to be told. In the next video, we'll explore the frostbite experiments, how Unit 731 froze prisoners alive until their limbs shattered like glass. If you believe these stories must be remembered, hit that like button and subscribe, because the world must never forget what happened at Unit 731.